always happy when Adam Apollo is on the scene because I learn so much. There's something, you know what, Adam, just from what I've noticed the last couple of years, you're combining your intelligence, your scientific inquiry, and your ability to access the spiritual realms into one body of knowledge. It's like you're synthesizing the next wave of the new human, where technology, spirituality, intuition, creativity comes together to be part of the human race's evolution. So does that make sense? Does that
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. Definitely in service to that.
Yeah, no, so I always enjoy listening to you. I mean, you blew me away at Disclosure Fest when you described the operational functions of the UFO. How would they actually fly through space and using the pole star? That's just like sunken in. I want to hear that 10 times.
Well, you're going to get to hear it again right now, because I decided to do that presentation for this group.
Wow, I'm not going anywhere, but go ahead. There's something you said at that lecture. It's just like, wow, he's put these pieces together. Why doesn't the government hire him to make this stuff happen? Because these are the secrets we're looking for that you've conceptualized and actualized. So yeah, okay, I can't wait to hear this. Thank you, Adam, for being here.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure, Alan. Thanks so much for having me and for just such a warm intro. I gotta get this grin off my face to get going.
No, it's not even intro. I mean, I'm just expressing my appreciation for you being part of our community and using your keen intelligence to move the envelope, to push the edge of knowing into something that we can all, as a community, start to work with. So yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you. I appreciate you so much. Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having an amazing Ultimate Star Beings conference so far. And I'm joining you today to essentially bring you into a little bit deeper insight into some of the physics and the mechanics of what it means to be a star being and or to interact with star beings. And frankly, how do we essentially become a galactic species here on Earth? So this next presentation will essentially take you through a little bit of journey in theoretical unified physics and then into Starship technologies. And then from there, we're going to actually touch on how those technologies and those levels of thinking and levels of operation relate to what it means to be part of a galactic culture. So how does a galactic culture work? How does an interplanetary culture work? And then look at some of the different species that are part of this galactic community that we're hoping to have reunion with, hopefully sooner rather than later. So to get going, I'm going to go ahead and drop us into a presentation, and thank you all for being here with me. It's really an honor and pleasure to be following these beautiful, amazing beings into this journey. So, this moment in the movie Star Trek, the new sequence of movies of Star Trek, where, Captain Kirk pulls up on his, electric motorbike to see the building of the Enterprise starship, was just such a powerful moment for me. It deeply gave me chills because I can feel coming down the road in the next few years. I can feel this moment where we are building these ships and we are traveling to the stars. And I imagine that many of you could feel that as well and sense that potency in this moment of time as a species, as we begin to truly open up our capacity to enter a whole new level of exploration among the stars. But how are we going to get there? How are we going to actually pull this off and do it? Well, in order to facilitate that, we have to understand the physics of space-time. All of the limitations that are proposed, even by, very, very mainstream and high-level physicists like Stephen Hawking, who literally says, extraterrestrial species won't come here because it'll take them too long, and most of their generations will die in the process, and it would take too much energy and it's a big waste of time. I deeply and strongly disagree, because the limitations of that concept are based on a limited structure of physics, where we think the only way to move through space-time is to push our way through the quantum vacuum and cause, the effects of acceleration, time dilation, and all of these major issues that essentially most mainstream physicists point to as why we can't go to the stars. But all of these are lacking, these theoretical models are lacking a deep understanding of what space-time actually is. And in order to find out what space-time is, we have to go back in history a little bit. We got to look deep into the origins of philosophy across cultures through time, from Rene Descartes to Pythagoras to Jacob Bernoulli and many, many other authors. Through time, we understood that there is a fundamental essence, an energetic structure that underlies the fabric of space and time. Now, when did this idea begin? We don't know, because it goes back further than our history, probably to the ages of Atlantis and Lemuria. And before that, where did it come from? Probably the stars. And that's another presentation, but I'm not going to get into that today. So we had this idea of this quintessence, this fifth element, this underlying ether, and this idea of what space-time is as an energetic field of force is all over the world. In the Egyptians, it's the Kaaba or the Ak. In Hinduism, it's the Mahabhuta. In Chinese, it's the Wujing. In Greek, it's the ether or aether. And into the medieval period, we called it the quintessence. It was understood as probably the force that causes gravitational effects by people like Newton, and then was sort of relegated to this idea of a luminiferous ether, essentially the fabric through which light travels, the medium that light travels through. And that idea really stuck around all the way until the turn of the 1900s. And we had this very clear picture that space and energy and ether and vital force and essence are all connected, that consciousness and space are connected. But wait, if that was our philosophy for thousands of years, what happened? Where did that go? And why did we lose that in, the 1900s and end up with all of these major problems? Well, the big issue, as in a lot of cases, came down to the church, because with churches, essentially, if you're talking about that thing that's underlying everything and causing all forces to come into existence, then you must be talking about God. And if you're talking about God, then you're talking about stuff that's in the domain of the church. And you better not be talking about that, because that's blasphemy unless you're a priest. And so a lot of the tension during the Enlightenment period, the reason Newton was an alchemist in secret, but not out in the open in the public, was because of these pressures by the church. And by the turn of the 1900s, scientists, physicists, philosophers were trying to essentially extract this idea. How do we take the ether out of the picture in order to not be interfered with by the church? And so these two guys, Michelson and Morley, came up with this idea of a tabletop experiment. And they thought that on a tabletop with some light and some splitters, they could essentially measure the pressure of the ether as the Earth is moving through space, similar to this diagram that you see here on the right. Now, first of all, this idea is really fascinating and interesting, because the idea of this is that space would be just moving through everything, moving through the earth, moving through the air, moving through all the things, and that somehow we'd pick up this movement of the earth going through space and not account for the fact that space around the earth might be moving with the earth. So they were lacking this very, very key idea that maybe Earth and its atmosphere and everything else that's moving is co-moving together. Now, this is also kind of a hilarious argument of people that believe the Earth is flat, because they say, well, if the Earth is a sphere, wouldn't we just fly off? Well, no, my friends, it's called gravity, and it's the curvature of space-time, and it's a flow towards the core of the Earth. And as the Earth spins, all of space, including its surface and its atmosphere, and even the space extending out around it, is co-moving with it. So we're in this field. And when Einstein went into special relativity, he was like, oh, well, we can describe light without the ether. So if we can describe light through this sort of first principle idea of how light works, then guess what? We don't need the ether. We can get rid of it. And it was really Einstein that sealed the grave on the ether to begin with. Yet, it only took a few years later to when Einstein published his theory in general relativity. And he says, according to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities, and therefore there exists an ether. So he literally says you can't have relativity without the ether. Yeah. And I'm not going to essentially play the audio in this video because many of you guys have heard this, but you can literally look up Einstein in the ether, and you can find his very small kind of hidden paper that essentially was censored, and nobody knows about it. Nobody knows he published this paper where that's absolutely critical to understanding that the ideas of the ether and his ideas of general relativity are the same thing. You don't learn that in college. You won't have a teacher tell it to you. You have to actually go do the work and pull up the research yourself. And so this is really fascinating that this critical idea at the heart of physics was missing. And because this idea is missing, we end up with this massive breaking point and divide in physics. So we end up with Einstein's theories of relativity, which cover light and all the big stuff like stars and galaxies and all of that. And we end up with quantum mechanics, which is all the theories of the small stuff. And all the theories of the small stuff generally break down to things like eventually string theory, loop quantum gravity, quantum mechanics, and we kind of end up with a bit of a mess here. We have these two different perspectives that maybe space is made of all of these little standing wave vibrating loops. And the musicians love this idea because it's like, wow, yeah, everything's vibrating and everything's music. And so there is an element of truth to that. And then on the side of loop quantum gravity, you got Lee Smolin and these guys, and they're like, oh, space-time is this like structural web of all of these loops that interconnect and form a discrete structure. It's actually like a lattice-like pattern, but we don't know what the geometry of that pattern is. And so you've got a very like masculine, feminine divide here. One guy is saying it's all structural, discrete. Space-time is actually a full system and crystal-like structure. And on the other side, it's all vibrating and loose and loopy, bro, and going through waveforms and flowing, And so from these two sides, we actually get a more real picture by them interconnecting. And that's part of the work of unified physics. From the standpoint of unified physics, we say, well, it's not enough if you just have a theory or an idea about space-time. You have to actually look and understand the patterns that exist at different scales. So why, for example, does the spiral of a galaxy match the spiral of a Nautilus shell or the spiral that a hurricane would follow? Why are these logarithmic spiral forms so self-similar? And what does that have to do with different geometries like the pentagon and the hexagon? And why do certain structures in the universe operate with very, very special features when they're in very special geometric forms? This points to that geometric lattice that the loop quantum gravity guys were talking about. But it also points to the fact that there are certain kind of curves and spins and vibrations that connect things together. And so back in the day, I came across the work of Buckminster Fuller back when I was in high school. And I was looking at how everything's got to come down to the triangle, because the triangle is the most simple, solid structure. And I started mapping and looking at how, if this crystal of space-time is triangulated, what kind of geometries does it make? What kind of things does it create? Now, I know you're saying, wait, what? You're talking about this in high school? Well, yeah, I was kind of a super geek in high school. I was also a raver kid. I'd go to big dance parties, dance all night, and have revelations about the universe, and then show up in school and try to talk to people about them. And I ended up doing my senior project in high school called The Unification of Science and Spirituality Through Unified Field Theoretics. And yes, that's the terrible design of the cover of this presentation there on the left. And I got deeply engrossed in the studies of Brian Greene around string theory and the work of Lee Smolin in loop quantum gravity and Gordon Kane around supersymmetry. How do things connect and entangle in space? Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg, all of these guys, I was like, these guys are too smart for them to not be pointing to something that's so obvious from a subjective experience or perspective. And that is that we are in a field of energy. We are bodies of energy. We are flowing in space-time, and we interact with things through our consciousness. And on the other side of my work and my studies, I was studying the chakras, energy systems, the harmonics of the universe, and Barbara Ann Brennan's work, how healing can happen by touching into these fundamental fields, and Dan Winter's work in some of the patterns and vibrations of the phi ratio. And so all of that work in high school led to me developing this unified harmonic matrix model, where I started to see that all the different layers of the universe were interconnected by the functions that they perform, but also interconnected by their connection to specific geometries that are inherent to the vibratory fields of our body, meaning that parts of our body vibrate in specific geometric ways with specific vibrational spectra, and that those vibrations actually interconnect us to the field of experience. And we call some of those interfaces chakras. And we also call some of those interfaces nadis. And those may be terms that some of you are familiar with through other forms. And so I essentially came into an understanding of dimensions and dimensional progression from a very, very first principle model. What happens when a point becomes a line, becomes a plane, becomes space, and then what goes on? How does our actual experience of reality become a series of permutating evolutions of awareness? And so I get into a lot of this in my unified harmonic matrix work, so I'm not going to get into it in depth here, but I will summarize just by saying it really all comes down to these three geometries. And when I first really got into the pentagram, the hexagram, and the heptagram, I started finding that so many of the codes of my life and of reality just began to lay themselves out in front of me, blooming in front of me. And I'm going to show you just a little bit more about why that is. But the real key is that these are harmonic vibrational geometries that link us into the structure of space-time. And if we start with simple patterns and understanding how geometry progresses and evolves, then from that, we can see literally how the universe constructs itself. That all different geometries and numbers are essentially evolutions of each other, harmonics of each other. And that this is actually the way that consciousness functions, is that you have very, very simple elements, very simple principles, but these principles interact in more and more complex ways, giving us eventually this hyper complex experience of reality. And, we can break that down by looking at even just the way computers work. So we know that a lot of what's going on that you're witnessing through your computer screen as I'm talking is all just ones and zeros, right? But somehow these two units, a 1 and a 0, combine in so many ways that eventually you can actually hear my voice through the transmissions across space-time, through giant, massive pipelines of electricity traveling around the world. You can see all of these geometries on your screen, and we can interact in these incredible and fascinating ways. And that's all just ones and zeros. So when you understand that, you start to see how through simple structures, space-time unfolds. And our bodies and consciousness and our chakras are essentially a reflection of that, that we use different levels of complexity to modulate our interrelationship and experience of reality around us. And not just receive information, but also propagate information into space-time, changing the results of the world around us. And understanding the fundamental mechanics of these geometries and vibrations allow us to begin to understand how we can actually become commanders of space-time, build starcraft, and travel the universe. Okay, so I know that was a lot. Let's slow down and go back a little bit, and let's just look at some of these fundamental mechanics that I'm talking about from a physics perspective. So as I said, in loop quantum gravity, we have these discrete structures to space-time. And they didn't know when they wrote these equations that worked to explain how gravity could be working at the smallest possible scales. They didn't know what the geometries were. And we also have another big problem, which is something called the vacuum catastrophe, which essentially, through quantum theory, what we should have is that in the space between things, the supposed empty space, because light is moving through it and we have to look at all of that light, we have to look at all of the energy in the space, the amount of energy that should be in empty space is so big that you should be able to essentially have the entire universe's worth of visible energy contained within every cubic centimeter of space. Now, that's a lot of energy in no space. So how does that energy exist, and where does it exist? Well, it all comes down to this little lattice. And this lattice of light, essentially, that's structuring the fabric of space-time itself, is also formed of essentially standing wave bundles of light. Now, what that is essentially in a physics standpoint is the Schwarzschild condition for a quanta of light, meaning that once you get down to a specific wavelength of light, in principle and in mathematical theory, the energy within that bundle of light or that one wavelength should be too large for the amount of space that it occupies, causing the Schwarzschild condition, which is a collapse into a mini black hole. So this already goes, wait a second, physicists are like, there's just no way that can even work. There's no way that's possible, that space-time is made of mini black holes. Like, how could that be? Because wouldn't it collapse on itself, or how does it work? How does it do it? Well, I'll tell you exactly how it does it. So space-time is always trying to find equilibrium. We know this from thermodynamics. You put energy into a system, equal energy comes out. Everything's always trying to balance itself out. And the geometry of balance is triangular. So we are used to seeing all these triangulated lattices. It's why a lot of us are obsessed with the flower of life as like a geometric structure. Well, yeah, it's a critical structure to understanding empty space and the way that energies relate and put themselves into balance when there's no curvature, when there's only equilibrium. And so while this is also a really powerful idea and a model to use and is very, very popularized by people like Nassim Haramein, it's also the model that says, as long as space is in this format, nothing exists. In other words, that space-time in total equilibrium, total balance, all that big energy is all completely balanced out, meaning that you have the experience of nothing, empty space. But in order to get us and matter and all the things, something has to happen to this structure. And so if we look at it from the standpoint of a concept called vibrational tensegrity, and the idea of tensegrity is something proposed by Buckminster Fuller, and that's the idea that if something has an equal push and pull, a radiation and absorption or attraction, and those things are in balance, then a structure can change form and stay just as stable and just as strong. And this is how geodesic domes are built. This is how a lot of the amazing architecture of the modern era are built, is through principles of tensegrity, push and pull. But at this quantum scale, what we're really talking about is an equalized state of push and pull that's energetic. So these little nodes of space-time, these quantum field vibrations, or what we call Planck spherical units, are radiative. So they're pushing apart with each other, but they're also attracted together. And they're so attracted together that they actually nest inside of each other. And this is where we get this flower of life-like shape. But in order to move from total equilibrium and nothing to the creation of something, meaning a proton or an atom, which comes from a proton, or anything else, all the way up to me or you and us having an experience in the universe, this thing has to shift. And for it to shift, what occurs is radiation and attraction and rotation. And so as radiation occurs from a point within this lattice, when one space moves out, the others move in. And as they move in, it causes a rotation. And as that rotation occurs, it allows curvature of the structure and the lattice, which is why if you've ever been in a geodesic dome and you looked up, you'll notice that at the top of the dome, while all of the points around are 6 triangles, and they're all these patterns of 6 triangles, that equilibrium state, at the very top, it's 5. And that 5 allows the structure to start curving. And the further apart those 5s are, the more gradual the curvature, and the closer they are together, the tighter the curvature. And this is what actually enables curvature in space-time, which interestingly enough is the curvature that enables mass. So matter and mass and weight all happens from this curvature of space-time, and space-time curvature is gravity. This is what Einstein is trying to tell us all this time. He says that as space-time curves, that is gravitational fields, and light follows that curvature of gravity. So if space-time itself is bent, then light is going to bend along with it. And that's what we see around stars and galaxies and black holes. So when we get down to the fundamental mechanics of space-time, essentially we're looking at how is space in equilibrium? What are the units of space that make curvature? What are the units of space that make spin? And I've been working on this stuff for a long time. I did these sketches back in 2013. But essentially, as you start to understand this pattern and the power of this pentagonal structure, you start to understand how different densities of curvature can occur and how an object could be layered with curvature. And this essentially resolves to revealing to us how the proton is created. So a proton is essentially many layers of space-time, like a massive layer cake of geodesic dome-like structures of little bundles of energy, all in tensegrity with each other, all co-moving together, creating essentially a spherical bundle of space-time. And it just happens that this little bundle of space-time gets to be spinning because the whole thing started spinning as soon as radiation and contraction occurred. If you remember my little diagram, the thing radiates out and it spins. So all of these things are spinning, and as it spins and the thing grows and gets out to a certain scale, there's a point where the spin gets so fast around the equator that suddenly it starts to shear the fabric of space-time. In other words, it reaches the speed of light. It reaches c. And at the moment that it's reached the speed of light around the equator, now the horizon, the edge of that proton is now solidified. And that is what we call the proton charge radius. So this contains the proton, and the proton is, with all of that curvature of space-time, because essentially it is a black hole, it's a singularity at the core, packed with layers and layers of geometry and geodesics out to its full scale. If it wasn't spinning like that, then yes, the physicists would be right. A black hole proton that's not spinning at the speed of the light at the equator would have a massive effect on other matter, pull everything into it, and cause gravitational curvature around it to be so strong that everything would get sucked into protons and everything would be collapsing in the universe. But the proton has a really nice solution to this. It spins at the speed of light at the equator, so it's acting with zero time and zero time dilation right at the equator. So protons last forever, we estimate that they last 4 times the lifetime of our current universe. So, but we haven't ever lived through an entire universe, have we? So we don't really know. They never get old. They never decay. Protons last forever. They're the most sustainable object in the universe, which is just crazy, right? And they actually are acting like little starships. They have figured out a way to separate the structure of space inside of the proton sphere from the outside. And by doing that, they've created a boundary condition that lets them float around as if they have no gravitational mass at all, or very little. And the very little is because as a sphere spins, the equator goes one speed, but as you go towards the poles, that speed slows down. And this is all related to my geodesic proton modeling and my quantum geometry course in the Resonance Science Foundation. And I'm writing papers on this as well. So a lot of this is yet to be published or known very widely, but you can learn more about that if you go to my course on the Resonance Science Foundation. And this is all very well proved by Nassim's work on quantum gravity and the holographic mass, although he does not define this geodesic geometry to the proton. And you can even see it in these renderings. These don't have pentagonal intersections. But what he does do is he is essentially showing that there's a relationship between the density inside a proton to the surface, and that this relationship of inside to outside in any black hole is where the real magic happens. So I'm not going to get into that in too much depth, but essentially there's so much more magic inside of each proton than you guys can even imagine. In fact, the amount of Planck oscillations in the proton happens to also be equal to the amount of Planck time units or Planck seconds in the lifetime of the universe, which is a discovery I made, which suggests that essentially every proton in the universe, in other words, everything that's making up your body, all the objects around you, have been remembering and storing a data point, a bit of data for every Planck second that's passed from the beginning of the universe. So if you want to know where the Akashic records are, guess what? They are everything. All matter is essentially storing its own memory of everything that it's ever experienced and everything that's ever happened. Wow. So that suggests that mass has a holographic memory structure. But what about the empty space? What about space itself? What about just the field of light and vibration and all of these things around it? Well, there's this idea in physics that's fairly new, which links 2 papers. One is called the Einstein-Rosen bridge, which is also known as a wormhole. And the other is the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen understanding of spooky action at a distance, is what Einstein called it. And essentially, it's entanglement. And these ideas were thought to be completely separate for a long time, until a guy named John Wheeler and some others started saying, well, what if entanglement between 2 places in space is a wormhole? Like, wouldn't it make sense that there's information, if information can be somehow transferred instantaneously, maybe space-time has some kind of gate connecting one area to another. Now, this gets really, really cool, because this starts to open up the idea that essentially you have the power of seeing that all of space-time is potentially interconnected through wormhole networks. Now, that might be a big thing to drop off the bat, but if you really look at it and you realize that all of space-time is made of light, and it's all just light in these different geometries, and inside something going the speed of light, no time exists, well, then how does information move through the thing at all? Well, it either passes in waves through the structure. In other words, what we see as light traveling is just the passing of a wave moving through this, liquid of space-time, or by 2 places in space-time vibrating in the same way with the same geometry, and suddenly they act as if they are the same point in space. Wow. Now that's a big deal, because if 2 places in space can essentially share information simply by getting into the same state, then doesn't that explain telepathy? Doesn't that explain how a mom can be entangled with her child because they share a lot of the same mental constructs? And so they have the same energetic structures. And so when the child goes outside and skins its knee, the mom is cooking in the kitchen and feels something has happened and goes out to find out what, right? Don't a lot of the spiritual concepts about how we're all one, how we can share knowledge, how we can tap into the same downloads suddenly make sense when we realize that we're always coming into self-similarity? In other words, we are harmonically, vibratorily aligning, we're radiating the same colors as other people and moving our minds into the same thoughts and the same geometries. 100th monkey effect, anyone? So from here, we have a good foundation to actually talk about Starship technology. And if we're going to get into this, we got to first point out the kind of ludicrousness of the way we're traveling through space right now. Right now, we think we just need to fill this big old pillar full of some, old dinosaur blood, essentially light the fuse on the bottom and ride this thing through space-time. We just push our way. And as we push, it's like, oh gosh, the G-force, which stands for gravitational force, is massive because we're accelerating and we're trying to push our way through space-time fabric. And this is why the more you try to push your way through space-time, the harder you push, the more space-time bends and fluxes around you, and the higher the resistance is, to the point where it would take infinite energy to accelerate all the way up to the speed of light. Now, that's the big problem that a lot of the mainstream physicists have proposed. You can't accelerate up to the speed of light. There's no way, because you got to be pushing your way through space-time. And that's why they think, it's no good. We're never going to get to travel the speed of light. It ain't happening, right? That's the general consensus. But there have been a lot of other ideas about this, because what if that push against this structure could be changed? What if there was a way to create anti-gravity where the structure would bend the opposite way, somehow pulling you through space-time? And so a lot of interesting ideas have happened around this, including ideas around negative mass, which led to the red matter in Star Trek, the idea of this, special matter that if you release it in the wrong place, it can literally swallow a planet, that kind of thing, and there's a sense that under our current physics, anti-gravity is not possible, except for under very contrived circumstances. But what would those contrived circumstances look like? Well, one of the ideas is called the Alcubierre drive. And the Alcubierre drive is this idea that you could maybe contract the space-time in front of a ship and expand the space-time behind a ship. Now, basically what you're talking about there is, imagine you're driving in your car to the store and you could somehow just bring the store closer to you as if it was only a block away instead of a mile away or 10 miles away. And that you could at the same time dilate the space behind you so that you just left home, but now home suddenly is a mile away and the store's only a block away. And so you're distorting space-time in front of and behind the craft in an attempt to move faster, potentially, than the speed of light. And this is really the core concept of the warp drive. The warp drive in Star Trek is all about this contraction and expansion of space-time. Essentially, you're trying to pull what you're trying to get to closer and contract or expand what's behind you in a way that pushes you away from where you came from. And they've put a lot of effort into this. We see videos coming out of NASA, essentially like, hey, look at this, this kind of thing could work someday. We could have this IXS Enterprise. But I want you to note one really particular thing as I show this video, which is essentially these rings. The ring on the front and the ring on the back, that's the most critical part of this entire design, because these guys are already starting to understand that the model of controlling space-time has to happen through creating some kind of ring-like envelope, some kind of way to essentially tap into the field of space and pull or adjust the harmonics of a part of that field, change its geometry, and tap into another area of space and change its geometry. But to be honest, this whole warp drive concept, is actually a lot harder to do than another potential way of changing our structure of space-time and traveling through the universe. But before we get there, I just want to point to a couple other models for this kind of space travel, just because I want to honor the people behind them. Roger Scheuer and Guido Fetta creating the resonance cavity thruster. These guys fundamentally proved that light, literally microwaves inside of a closed cavity, just from the light bouncing around in there, it causes propulsion. And this like broke the physicists' minds. They're like, no way. That's like, there's no way, nobody's going to be able to prove that works. Well, it was tested successfully 2001, 2006, the Chinese tested it, 2008, NASA Eagle works, 2014, 2015. It absolutely works. And how it works is that we now understand with physics, that's proven that the movements of light and waves of light can cause propulsion of an object. In other words, light and space talk to each other. Light and space, because space is light, space is made of light. So of course they talk to each other, but you can use light waves to change the flow, the structure, the curvature of space for propulsion. And there's another really related idea to this, which is field resonance propulsion, which is essentially the idea that you could leverage gravitational waves themselves to propel yourself. But again, it's actually the same idea, because what is a gravitational wave? It's just a structural flow of space-time, and space-time is made of a lattice of light, right? And so this leads to circulating light beams, which is an even better idea, which essentially is the idea that using unidirectional ring lasers, you can circulate, spin a field of light, and create your own artificial closed time-like curve. In other words, you could bend space-time, connecting your location to another location. And the guys that came up with this, they're like, this is brilliant, this could work, but I have no idea how we would bend space that much. How would we pull space-time to our location? It's got to take insane amounts of energy. And so what I propose is you don't need to actually pull another location in space-time to you at all. You don't have to create a closed time-like curve or a wormhole. All you need to do is separate the object that you're in from its surrounding space-time structure. In other words, creating a little bubble around it, allowing it to travel freely through the structure. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more, but first, let's touch on a few more concepts. So all of space-time is made of light. Light moves through space-time essentially as this structure itself ripples. So, you know, if you've ever watched water where there's something sitting on the water and it goes up and down, and the water itself may not be moving much, but waves are moving through it. That's the way that light is moving through this Planck spherical structure of spacetime. And spacetime itself is flowing towards gravitational hubs. So when you hold out your hand and you let your hand fall, your hand is actually riding the flow of spacetime. Spacetime is flowing down into the earth. And so what you're actually feeling when you hold your arm up is the pressure of the spacetime flow that's moving into the core of the earth. And so you're in a resistance to the flow that's happening because of the space-time curvature. And that's it. So all you got to do is remove that curvature around you and your hand floats. Maybe this is how certain people, and my stepmom, by the way, could do this. She was deep psychic and a very, very amazing being, solved massive crimes with her psychic abilities. But levitation could be literally just someone getting into a state that's so deeply connected to the singularity source of existence that they begin propagating a field which essentially operates as if they are in their own dimension of space. They're in their own space-time field. And so the gravitational field of the Earth no longer has an effect. And if we look at, you know, all of these different integrative systems, you know, from the work of Walter Russell to Nick Anthony Ferenza, we start to get back into the string theory idea. We start realizing everything's harmonic, everything's a song, and all we got to do is play the right notes. and the universe responds, that the entire universe is musical. And we can see that in things like archetypal relationships by the 4 directions of the Lakota and the Mayan and many indigenous cultures, or through the 4 tools of the Tuatha De Danann that we know and understand as the tarot, through the 4 elements. And we start to see that the keys of some of these technologies have essentially been hidden in and baked into structures on the planet that we can't explain how they were created. Their mathematical advancement is so far beyond anything that we know or understand today that we're just now discovering how all the proportions of the Great Pyramid, for example, contain all of these mathematical constants that weren't even discovered until the last 100 years. And the work of people like Alan Green is definitively proving the density of this magic. And it all comes back to an understanding, again, of these fundamental geometries, that the dynamics of matter occur through geometric relationships, and that there is huge importance to the geometric relationship in the pentagram, for example, from fire, air, earth, water, and spirit, or what we call thermodynamics and aerodynamics and geodynamics and hydrodynamics now. Essentially, we've known that this has a key to how mass, matter, and reality are constructed. There's a reason why all the earth religions point to it as the symbol for creation, because it literally modulates physical creation in the universe. And then you start to wonder why certain groups of, the Eastern Star Freemasons use it as their symbol, or why the Pentagon is a pentagon shape. Like, is there a reason why these groups may have used this symbol? I think so. And then we have other symbols like the hexagon, and we see its use in everything from symbols of Solomon to churches to the dollar bill, to graphene and beehives. And we start to see that there's a power of energetic or electromagnetic transmission that this structure has. It's a structure of equilibrium. How do you allow equilibrium to exist within a space? And then, of course, we have the heptagram, and the heptagram we find in all kinds of magical works from people like John Dee, back to the symbols of the 7 visible planets from the days of Pythagoras, to the California Highway Patrol and the seal of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. And in the Unified Harmonic Matrix work, I show how this has a lot to do with the mind, this system, this structure, and that this mental structure is also about essentially radiation. So the 5 is all about contraction into form, the 6 is all about equilibrium, and the 7 is all about radiation. And once you understand those 3 concepts, now we've got the key to Starship technology applications. We can create internal gravity within a ship and essentially stabilize the internal field of that ship. We can create 0-point boundaries between what's happening inside the ship and outside the ship using our equilibrium model. And then we can use the 7 to essentially establish what I call superluminal positioning. In other words, how do you communicate back to space-time around you where you are located? Because one thing we know about quantum mechanics is that perception and the objects of communication within entangled fields can literally define where an object is and whether it exists or not, and whether it's spinning or not, or which way it's spinning. We know that space-time is in a feedback conversation with us. All right, so how do we apply all these things together? Well, you put these 3 geometries together and you get something that I like to call the Starship ring system. Now, this ring system is essentially about using the internal ring to modulate the internal gravity of the craft, the center ring to establish the 0-point boundary with space-time, and the outer ring to essentially communicate the position of that craft to the surrounding space. So this ring system, you'd say, well, okay, but why? Why is it a ring? Well, because rings essentially can form the horizon or the boundary condition for a spherical space of energy. And interestingly enough, what do we see when we see all these UFOs? Why are so many of these things shaped like saucers, shaped like rings, essentially, right? And of course, there's other models, the triangulated ships and the pill-shaped ships, but all those take is having the ring system embedded in the corners of the triangle or at the ends of the thing. But essentially, we can look at this and say, okay, got it. These guys probably have a gravitational control device. It's running in a ring system around the outer boundary. If it's going into a planetary atmosphere, you can use things like sonic ultra low frequency propulsion to essentially cause, a vibrational response to the structure of the air within that region, which would explain a lot of observations and potential technologies like crop circles, using very, very high level cymatics combined with holographic laser light. You could actually use light to focus groups of sound to vibrate a bunch of molecules in a specific pattern and cause wheat to go like this and go like this and weave around itself and essentially form a geometric form and do it in seconds. And that's exactly what different kinds of farmers have seen. Craft come down, some kind of light comes out, and suddenly there's a crop circle seconds later. And these things are massive, massive, massive structures. So essentially, we're creating this internal consistent space-time, and the external position for the craft is dynamic. So inside the ship, you've got gravity, you're hanging out, you're talking, everything's just like it's normal. But where the ship is located is completely based on the pilot and the positioning of the ship and its communication to their surrounding space. And so essentially, the ship is telling space-time where it's located instead of the other way around. So it can travel and move, but it can also move suddenly 90 degrees, and there's no gravitational effect on the inside of the craft, no G-force. Why? Because it's not connected to the surrounding space-time. So the objects can shoot 90 degrees and fly off. I know probably some of you, like me, have seen many shooting stars suddenly turn 90 degrees, and then for sure it's definitely not a meteorite because they don't do that. And it's a fantastic thing to witness and see. And this has really puzzled the engineers because they're like, well, how the heck would it do that? That's you see these videos coming out in different news releases about disclosure, and they're like, the thing just went to 30,000 miles an hour like that, like that would just crush us. Maybe these things are not even alive in there. Maybe it's just a robot ship. And it's like, no, guys, these things are using space-time in order to create their own consistency and interact with movement in whatever ways they want, including, by the way, going into states much faster than the speed of light, or even instantaneously jumping to another star system. So how do we build a superluminal spacecraft? Well, we need a good generator, we need life support, we need a gravity drive, a good atlas, communication system, navigation systems. And I spent many years looking at exactly what it would take to develop each one of these different areas. And a lot of my personal work and projects essentially are focused on using and gamifying existing technologies to push forward more and more of these different kinds of technology projects. Now, I also know and am working with other people who are absolutely working on gravitational drives, on energy systems, scalar resonance capture. I know others working on mind-computer interface technology, essentially allowing us to use an external ship as a device that we can control with our minds, which is really critical because we need to have the consciousness interface with the technology of the craft to be able to control that craft's location and be able to do things like jump to other places. Because you can't use radar to detect, is it clear 20 light years away? You have to astrally project to that location and see whether it's clear or not. And you can utilize telepathy, which is remote viewing and connection with another person, or non-local quantum coherent entanglement, to essentially link with other beings who essentially are also acting as, space traffic control, you could say, around different kinds of planetary systems. And so there's literally spiritual upgrades that we are in a process of on this planet, developing remote viewing, telepathy skills, understanding that these are real sciences, starting to actually practice that work. And if you're interested in becoming a Starship pilot, I highly recommend you get into that kind of work. So I won't go into all of these in full detail, but I welcome you to, just take notes here and study some of these different areas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about navigation, because how we get from one star system to another is more than just astral travel. It actually requires us to know something about the locations that we want to arrive around. And in order to do that, there's a very specific key. Now, every star, many of you may know this, and some of you may not, that every star has its own very specific spectral frequency. In other words, no star has the same frequency set. Every star has a slightly different one. And because of that, you can imagine that every single star is its own particular cryptographic hash, if you're into, crypto technologies and things like that. But essentially, it's a secured object data point that only exists in its own way, and period. There's only one of them. And this is a really powerful tool used by galactic cultures, because they've come to understand that if you want to create a clear channel for telepathy, for communication, and this applies to contact work, well, all you need to do is focus on a few different stars. And now you've created your own specific combination of spectral frequencies, and you've entered into your own pipeline of information transmission. Now, that's pretty cool, right? But I'm telling you, it's absolutely practical. This is why things like dolphin star linking work, where you look at one star and then another star and another star and another star, and then you ask to have contact with some. It's also a very, very powerful tool for clear telepathy, essentially focusing on a group of stars and then choosing and intending to contact a particular person. And now you have a very clear harmonic channel that your consciousness just somehow knows how to use. Now, when it comes to interstellar navigation, this is a little bit more interesting, because if you're trying to travel to a location on the other side of the galaxy, and you're trying to use existing stars that you can see right now and the way that you look at them, well, that has some problems, because those stars have moved. They've also aged. The spectral frequencies of stars change over time as they age. And so a star that's 10,000 light years away has aged 10,000 years in this time, which means its frequencies may not be exactly the same as they are right now. So if you're just trying to use random stars around the galaxy to jump and travel to different points, in other words, what we're going to do is triangulate to a specific point, thanks to Gemma Frisius. And by that triangulation, we're going to identify a place that we're going to jump to on the other side of the galaxy. But unfortunately, using most stars doesn't work. So what can we do? Well, it turns out there's a very particular kind of star that we know a bit about, but these objects are some of the most fascinating objects in the universe. They're called pulsars. And a pulsar literally is this super fast spinning bundle of highly compressed mass and matter. And essentially, it's spinning super fast and sending a consistent pulse of light energy out all around it into the galaxy. And as it does this, the pulse frequency and the frequency of the pulsar stay perfectly consistent in a perfect linear progression over long, long periods of time. Now, I believe that there's one gentleman who back in the day actually proposed that pulsars may actually be navigation beacons left for us by an advanced civilization that was long before humanity ever existed. And I'm more and more in alignment with that theory, because they literally act like lighthouses. And the power of of pulsars, they're also evenly distributed across the galaxy. It's almost like, oh, well, we'll just put pulsars in all these spots, get these stars spinning in this way and pulsing in this way. And then we have navigation beacons all over the galaxy that we can use to triangulate location and use to jump our starships to places around the galaxy. So through a library of pulsars, we can essentially establish a navigation library that we can use to triangulate the specific harmonic frequencies in any location. And those harmonic frequencies essentially then can translate down to our actual physical experience and the ship actually jumping to those locations in space-time. So that's how we do it. And consciousness interacting with the ship provides the guidance system. So you're astrally projecting to the location. The ship with biofeedback is helping to establish what's the triangulation of the local pulsars within our star atlas that relate to that location. The combination provides the harmonic frequency set and the mental picture set that tells us exactly where that location is, and the ship can jump there. So if all of these things are true, then we are essentially positioned to enter this age where we become part of this galactic family of species who already figured this stuff out. They already know how to use telepathy because they've leveraged it to communicate with each other across star systems and vast distances in space for millennia, many, probably hundreds of thousands to millions of years. And because of these capacities, the ability to telepathically communicate, the ability to remote view in order to see a location that you're going to jump a starship to, you also get really, really good at some very, very fundamental functions that to us here on Earth, we consider to be kind of spiritual ideas, right? Which is the idea like astral projection. Astral projection says that you have a physical body, an etheric body, and an astral body. And the astral body is a mental form that you can use to transpose your consciousness to another location in space-time. Now, it's also suggested that certain high-level masters at astral projection can essentially affect space-time very strongly wherever their astral body shows up, to the point that they can provide a perception of what they look like. They can manifest that light bends in a certain way in that area where they are. And suddenly now we have this really excellent explanation for why people wake up in bed and there's some blue beings looking like they're made out of light standing in their room saying, "What's up? Hi, by the way, you're Pleiadian like us." You'll figure that out later in life when you meet some dolphins and you go swimming in the ocean and you start using music as a way to heal yourself and people. And then boom, they disappear. Well, guess what? It's not because they're ninth dimensional beings that don't exist in the physical. It's because they're on a starship and they're astrally projecting down in order to communicate with you. And I think a lot of confusion happens around different extraterrestrial species and races, primarily due to some of our lack of understanding of dimensionality, the nature of the planes of existence, our understandings of the physical, etheric, and astral world. I mean, for most people, even knowing that the etheric, the astral, and the causal bodies exist, you got to be pretty occult. You got to be really into magic. You got to be into studying ancient ways of looking at the universe. And so they're out of reach for most people's ideas. And yet, when we understand these concepts and we understand how a ship can separate itself from the surrounding space-time, suddenly now how a ship flies into a star like the sun, or into a planet, or enters a mountain and goes into the earth, all of these things suddenly start to make sense. And maybe it's not because they're just in another dimension in some kind of spiritual world, and we are just interacting with that spiritual world. Of course, they're in the spiritual world, but they're also in the physical world. And that physical world technology is just more advanced than what we know of or think of as possible. And of course, this rolls all the way down as we look at these spiritual concepts down to the nature of our relationship with beings in general. We start to understand that maybe there's a difference between seeing your dead grandmother and having a relationship with someone who's in the spirit world and seeing someone who's astrally projecting to talk to you. That there's actually very, very tangible differences in those experiences. We start to look at things like possessions in a different way, and the realities of people interfacing with different kinds of beings in different ways. I still see all the time on my Instagram posts by people who are saying, oh, the aliens are already here, but the aliens are non-physical and they're just possessing people and they're just taking over the world in that way. And I just say to that, well, wow, first of all, that's a pretty disempowering statement, because you can't ever know if someone is, taken by an alien or not. They may just be doing something you don't like, and suddenly you think they're part of an evil force that's here to control you. The same thing with, right now in our mental space, we get into a lot of disagreements. We have a lot of conflicts of ideas of what's true and what's not. In a sense, we're all very, very confused in many, many ways, because we've been driven into a place of confusion by a lot of very powerful disinformation campaigns. And in results, if you say something that you're questioning or, looking at beliefs and you're saying that's probably not really true because it doesn't match with my experience, you can have people say, well, that means then you must be evil and you must be part of the dark forces and you must be part of the cabal and you must be controlling the world also, and you're just in secret. And I get these kinds of accusations all the time, you guys, and it's pretty ridiculous. And, especially as a kid who grew up in a trailer park and I'm just figuring out the universe one step at a time and trying to share it. And then the next thing you know, you've got people like, oh, you must be black and ops and awful and, with the reptilians and all these things. And essentially what I'm trying to say to all of that, to kind of bring you guys into a deeper level, is that if you start to understand the way the mechanics of consciousness work, and you start to understand how people's behavior emerges from things like trauma, and you start to look at how a lot of times our deepest fears are reflections of our own stuff that we really need to look at, you start to see that the universe is a lot more benevolent than we think. And that a lot of the bad things that really happen in the world are happening because of patterns of trauma that require healing. And that little leap in understanding, where we start to actually embrace everyone and realize that everyone is actually just coming from a different place and down a different path and have different levels of trauma and different levels of experience and different levels of issues, those realizations help create a bridge for us to create understanding and acceptance at a level that's required to become stewards of a planetary species as diverse as humanity is. And we're not alone in that, because many, many species out there have already figured out how to unify their people and come together as a planetary species. So in this next segment, I'm going to just show you some of the worlds of these beings: the Syrians, the elves, dual sun system, so massive, massive trees on their planet, a deep relationship with life and the earth, the Pleiades, a water planet where these beings evolved from, and this water planet birthing all kinds of incredible structures and different ways to commune with water and shape water to create life. The Arcturian system, a planet around a very big red star that's burned away a lot of the water on the surface, so they've gone underground, create records and systems for memory. The Yahonian system, jungle planets like Dagobah, where peoples have learned the magic and the power of plant medicine to share with each other. The Shiheli, the desert planets, the galactic samurai, guardians who had to face the reptilians during the first part of the Orion Wars and develop the capacity to learn how sacred purpose can unite us and strengthen us and be the power of invincibility. The Locrinon system, where their planet was destroyed when their star went supernova as Cassiopeia A. And they're often seen as sort of the angelic beings of the galaxy because they store a lot of the astral memories and constructs of different worlds. The Zeta Reticuli, who we know as the Greys, not fully a part of the galactic community yet because they participated in the Orion Wars and were cloned into different soldiers to fight. Dragons, Nagura, and of course, the reptilians, hybrids made by dragon DNA, and who essentially went through a massive, massive wound of having their family's DNA taken from them and then incarnating on other planets, to the point that as a species, they thought they had to take revenge against different humanoid species in the galaxy. and who as a whole are not part of this Galactic Council community yet, but many of whom have gone through healings, resolutions, and are part of that community, supporting different worlds and healing in different places. We always have more to learn when we look at these things. These are just glimpses at some of the worlds that have gone through transitions, leveraging these kinds of technologies to begin to understand how we can travel the universe and discover more about ourselves. But if we really want to understand ourselves, we have to be listening. We have to be learning about others. We have to take in the knowledge and the wisdom and the information of other cultures out there. And sometimes that also means learning what people are going through that you may consider to be enemies, that you may consider to be bad or awful, you know, and I've had enough people in my life essentially come at me and attack me and try to make false claims about me and essentially do these things to realize that really each one of those opportunities is a moment where I can look deeper at myself, do the shadow work within to become a better person, and also not take it all personally, because a lot of times people's projections come from their own wounds. And by looking at those wounds and accepting them for who they are and the journey they've been on, and realizing that I can't control their growth, I can't control their change, then I start to actually say, all right, well, maybe there's something I can learn from the way that this person is going through this pattern and acting in this way. And by learning a little bit about that, maybe I can serve other people in a better way. Maybe I can show up in better ways, even with people that I'm in conflict with. Maybe I can realize that we're all in a journey that's not always easy here on this planet. It's full of a lot of collective trauma and a lot of collective karma, and that we have to do the work to actually resolve that stuff. And it starts inside. It starts with facing the pain of our own childhood, our own growth, and our own evolution, and really, really doing the work to get into the places where we're reactive, where we're triggered, where we have nervous system responses to things, and actually do the healing work to bring ourselves into greater harmony and balance so that we can be stewards and beacons and bringers of harmony and acceptance as we as humanity rise to our great destiny as a galactic species. Thank you very much. My name is Adam Apollo, and of course you can learn about me in a lot of places, and these are some of the different areas and sites and projects that I'm working on. Core Nexus is the big one. That one's coming next year, so keep an eye out for that. And you can always just go to my website and sign up for my newsletter. I don't send them out very much, but if I'm going to be at a place in person or teaching somewhere and hanging out, and you want to come hang out with me, come to my site, get on my mailing list, and you'll find out about it. I think the next really big adventure that I'm doing is I'm teaching on a cruise next spring. It's called the Hidden Secrets Cruise. And so I'll be sending some more info about that on my mailing list again soon. So if you want to find out about that, just go there. And thank you guys so much for having me for this awesome session.
Incredible, Adam. Thank you so much, brother.
Wow, I needed to hear that again, and I need to hear it again, because it
So
really covered everything, didn't that, Neil? Wasn't that the ultimate star being lecture?
That's what I was thinking. Like in the last 5 minutes, I was just like, well, this is what the event's all about. Like
Nice.
Just taking it out of the cosmos, but then bringing it into what's really important, us doing the inner work, right? So,
But the science too, he laid out the science, and it's just so much to break down in there. The fact that every star has its own frequency goes along with my idea that the stars set the frequency of consciousness for the beings in that star system.
Yes.
And that's why it's so hard sometimes to connect with these other beings, because their consciousness vibration is at a different rate to ours. So
well, if you just look at it, I mean, every plant, all of the ways that leaves do their work on our planet is all based on the frequency of our sun. Our skin is based on that frequency. The way that matter is on our planet is all based on that star's frequency. So of course the stars are shaping the beings, as you said.
And the calibration of consciousness is not always interfaceable, because it can be, because the soul essence can reach them, but what we think as raw consciousness can be shocked by the presence of these beings, because they're calibrated at a much different level. So also want to ask you about the proton for a second. Doesn't the proton break down into parts? Aren't there elements? Or is the proton just energy that's coagulated and it doesn't really exist as a particle? I mean, what's really going on there?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Alan. And, the reality is that in order to see quarks, which are what make up a proton in our current kind of modern physics philosophy, we have to take two protons and slam them together at almost the speed of light. And when we slam them together, we have all this wreckage that comes out. It's like the thing like shatters, right?
Yeah.
And when it shatters, we kind of take pictures of the wreckage as it's all flying apart. And what we've done is essentially gone, okay, well, there's usually a pattern of some spin going this way and some spin going this way. So that must mean that these are a certain kind of quark and these are another kind of quark. But guess what? That wreckage vanishes in a split second. It's gone. It dissolves right back into space-time. So quarks are one of the smallest timelines of life of any particle that we know of. And it's because they don't exist on their own. But a proton, on the other hand, they are the longest lasting particle that we know of.
Wow.
So which one's more fundamental? The wreckage or the thing,
So the what is it called? The quarks?
Yeah,
Quarks.
And that's what the proton is made out of, or it's made out of multiple things, including that?
I believe the proton is actually simply a co-moving field of Planck spherical units forming geodesics. And you can imagine just like a ton of these small vibrations forming a sphere. And the sphere has two polar regions and an equator region. And so if you smash this thing apart, anytime you impact a fast spinning spherical object, what happens is the polar regions tend to eject in a certain way, and the area around the center or the horizon ejects in a different way. And I think it's from that we get the two up and a down quark that we call a proton. But
what's the purpose of doing that anyway, smashing protons?
Well, we think that it's telling us what these things are made of, but what it's actually resulted in is a map of all of these little ways that objects like protons destroy themselves, like how they decay or dissipate. But the problem is it doesn't tell us that much about how the proton actually works, because protons don't do that. They never do that on their own. We're artificially creating a condition that we think is teaching us about it. But I'd say it's much more prominent to actually understand space-time itself and the way space-time would create a proton, because then you have the roots for the actual ways that a proton works and operates, and its data storage and all these other cool things that have come out of this, research path I just kind of got on the rabbit hole of many years ago.
It's like taking a rubber ball and saying, why does that bounce? And you smash it to see what's inside of it. It's
Nassim used to say, it's basically like flying two 747s together and crashing them together in midair, and then taking pictures of the explosion and all the pieces and trying to use those pictures to describe how the 747 flies.
Right.
So I read a couple of years ago an article from CERN saying that when they were colliding the protons together, they were seeing something escape. And then they said that it was escaping because it was vanishing, and it was escaping into a fifth dimensional bulk, was what they used in order to explain it. Did you hear about that? What do you feel? Because you said it vanished, but well, here's a good question: does energy always exist, or can it be dissolved into nothingness, or is this energy in this case dissolving into that bulk, or just completely dissolving and dematerializing?
Yeah, well, that answer to that's a little bit like physics oriented, but I'll just say that there's these guys named Kaluza and Klein, and they essentially came up with this theory that that the energy in space-time is oscillating as a fifth dimension, right? But what they were really essentially saying is that there's an embedded vibration to the energetic structure of space, and you don't actually need a fifth dimension to define it, because you can just say, oh, well, that's inside these bundles of space-time. Like they have their own self-contained holographic fractal relationship to each other. And so it's as if each of them are in their own little dimensional world, so to speak, right? And so when these quarks bust apart, they are amalgamations of these little bundles of space-time, but not coherent enough to stay together. So that little piece of the crystal essentially tries to move back into equilibrium. And as it's moving back into the triangulated lattice of equilibrium, it just merges into the structure of space in that location. So it's not that the energy goes anywhere, dissolves. It literally is added to that area of space-time, but it goes into the hexagonal lattice in such a way that it seems that it disappears completely.
Right. Because we can't perceive that separate from the proton because it needs to be a part of it, basically, right?
Yeah, because that structure can't hold itself together. That's why the geodesics that I was talking about, like that's why that structure is so powerful, because it's actually in vector equilibrium. It's got 12 vortices. It's in perfect balance the same way that empty space is in balance. So it's like curved space in balance and empty space in balance. The universe is pretty smart.
Well, I have to ask you about pulsars because that's the most fascinating. Also, one of the Nadi had a similar feeling. Someone obvious created the pulsars. First of all, does every pulsar also have its own vibrational spectrometry uniqueness? And is that how we find our ways around? So if we can register the frequency of the pulsar and set our instruments to that, or are conscious to that, we're pulled to that coordinate in space-time. But who do you think created that pulsar? I totally agree. They were placed there. They had to be, because so what's going on? Have you remote viewed the past and say who was the genius race of beings that put that there?
No, I haven't. I have asked a few times, but I've never gotten a really straight answer. And I wonder if I'm not getting a straight answer either because a lot of species don't know. Like it might even be back before they have knowledge, or it's just kind of very closely held because it's it's like it's some kind of beings at the level of galactic architecture that's so profound that, I mean, can you imagine you take a red giant star or whatever, star at a very advanced period, and you have a technology so powerful you can control the entire field of that star, cause it to compress in, maybe even join a few stars together to get it to be that dense, and get its spin going. I mean, it's either just like source creation has baked this in to the process of how galaxies form just to prepare beings for being able to use them as transmission devices, or were created at some point by some extraordinarily powerful galactic beings.
Right.
But what I get when you said you haven't been able to find out, maybe in your own evolution, it's not time.
Yeah, maybe I wasn't ready. That's a great point.
No, not that you're right, because as you get into the pulsar work, I think that's going to be a major field to study for you, because that is sort of the secrets to galactic matrix. And so that's a huge field. One more thing you said is that, and it's what Hal Puthoff said to me when we talked about UFOs. He said, what do you think the propulsion is? Asked him, and he said, well, maybe, he didn't say they were, but maybe they're pushing time space out of the way and moving through time space, which you hinted at, right?
Yeah. Except that in Hal's idea, you still have to try to move medium to get yourself going through it.
A lot of energy, yes.
And you're still trying to control a huge amount of space-time that you have no control over, which is the main problem with the warp drive. Whereas if all you're controlling is your own event horizon, right? And here's the key, because we're all realizing this in consciousness. If you can change your perception, things change around you, right? And so the same idea or basic philosophical concept works here. If you control your own event horizon, then you can change the position or movement of your craft, and you don't have to influence anything else around you.
Right. Well, that goes along with the other question I asked Hal about teleportation. I said, have we teleported things? and he may have not told me the whole truth. He says, we haven't teleported things, but we've teleported properties of things, properties of atom, which equates to the actual thing. If you're teleporting the property of an atom, then you're actually teleporting that. Like when I send you an email, I'm not sending you the thing that's on my desktop. I'm sending you the properties of that thing. So if we can cognize through consciousness the properties of this other locale, we can manifest that right there. We can move our body through space-time because we've accessed the frequency of that location.
Yeah, I mean, it really gets into like understanding that quantum states, in other words, a quantizable state of vibratory fields, essentially is an information structure. And what we know is that information structures can be transmitted and have entanglement and teleportation. We've done it between Earth and satellites instantly.
Yeah,
right?
that's spooky.
And so
yeah,
the only thing we don't understand yet in the kind of general properties of the physics of this is like, okay, but how do you capture an entire quantum state of an entirely complex thing like a whole body? Like, how would you actually read the entire quantum state of this entire thing? And what I always say to that is you don't have to. All you need to do is create a membrane, and this is how you make stargates, right? And I had long dialogues with Galactic family about this one because I wanted to really get it clearly. And essentially they said, you just build a gate over here and a gate over here, and they're rings, of course, right? And you basically create a quantum coherent field state inside of the plane of space in the center of this ring that exactly matches the quantum field state in this ring. And then suddenly they act as if they're the same point in space. And so if something goes through that point in space, it exits the other point in space because you're actually creating a connection between those 2 points in space-time through creating a self-similar quantum state, which I just think is awesome. I think we can do that.
So could the pulsars be gatekeepers for certain wormhole openings in time space that allow those rings to operate more easily or more functionally?
You don't even really like with the ring system, you don't need the pulsar. The pulsar is more for like tracking beacons for triangulating locations that are in distance that your ship may want to travel to. Because ships don't need to go through the rings. They have their own quantum gravity field. And so they essentially just identify, okay, this pulsar is here with this frequency, this one's here with that frequency, this one's here with that frequency. And there's a combination of those frequencies and the waveforms in them that changes at any point in space within that triangulation. And so you identify the mathematical combination of that triangulated field. And now you have a resonant sequence of vibrational spectral fields in a very specific pulse state. In other words, the speed of the pulse of each pulse star. And now you have what you can essentially transmit to this superluminal positioning ring to have the craft tell space-time, I want to match that exact frequency and pulse state. And now the craft is in that location.
So are you doing teleportation? Are you making, if you want to tell us, teleportation rings to teleport bodies in these quantum field ring type matching frequencies? Are you actually creating that?
You know, if I had the capital to set up a lab to build these kinds of ring systems, I would absolutely be on it. But I figure, you know, right now, I think the key is education and creating clear communication systems and essentially creating the Starship navigation system itself. How do we interface with it? So I'm building that part. Other people are working on gravity drives. And I think once I succeed enough with CoreNexus, I'll be able to set up those labs and actually build and test the ring systems.
Amazing.
Right. And go ahead, Neil. Yeah.
Go ahead, Alan. I'll ask right after yours.
No, I just wondered about the Stargate stuff because we're all about Portal to Ascension and Stargates, Neil. I was just wondering, building a Stargate, is that something you foresee? And would that be a sort of wormhole Einstein-Rosenberg bridge?
Yeah, exactly. The way I described those rings essentially is that each ring acts as an end of an Einstein-Rosen bridge. But unlike in current physics, where we think we have to somehow bend space from one zone to another, it's actually much more simple. You just entangle one space to another. And the entanglement acts as the membrane that is an Einstein-Rosen bridge. And that's what I was trying to get at with my briefing on like ER equals EPR and stuff. There's a lot to say. So I try to stay high level and interesting for people who might not be physicists listening in.
Well, I also want to say, anyone who has a question, put it in the chat, please. I'm not the only one asking questions. Go
I
ahead,
have some
Neil.
questions, but we can do rapid fire for my questions if you want.
No, it's okay.
Okay, cool.
Let's go, guys. Let's go.
I got a lot of questions, man. I want to get your opinion on things, okay? So, firstly, did you hear about the so there's been a few anomalies in space that have slipped over into the mainstream. One of which was, I don't know if you came across this one around 3-4 years ago. There was a pulsar star, and there was this huge structure in front of it, and it came out in mainstream news that we've detected possibly some, like even mainstream scientists are saying this has to be some alien device. They could tell because there's this structure in front of a pulsar that was blocking the frequency coming off the pulsar in certain intervals in a rhythm. And then they even speculated, that it was pulling energy out of the star in order to, I don't know, power itself up or something. Have you heard about that? Do you know anything about what that was?
Yeah, I had heard about that, but I don't know a lot. I didn't go into a lot of the scientific articles and what people were proposing as a solution for it. But I would say probably at first glance that, yeah, it's likely, a very powerful advanced civilization device that someone's using somewhere is either as an energy aggregation source or possibly as like a secondary beacon on that pulsar to help modulate arrival in and out of that region. I mean, you can imagine, like, you think about it like this, like we have all these radar towers and all of these flight centers and all these things that we use to coordinate transportation on Earth. Well, now consider 200 billion stars and consider you've got hundreds of species, probably all traveling between the stars. I know there's at least 73 that I've been in contact with, right? And they're all essentially all the time, little starships, private ships, group ships, whatever, they're jumping between star systems. So you got to have like a major network of beacon points and beings coordinating arrival and departures from different star regions. There's just like a massive amount of, navigation support that goes on out there.
So not everything, we have a question from Mauri, we'll get to in a second. So not everything is at a frequency where we can't perceive it. Right? Because it's a frequency game in the cosmos, but that was right there. We were able to see it because we're expanding our perception of the visible universe.
Well, yeah. And also just keep in mind that, so far, the way that we detect planets is we watch stars and see if a planet passes in front of the star. And from doing that, we know that 95% to 99% of all stars in our galaxy have planets, right? That's just because every time we've really looked, we tend to know that there's some kind of star distortion going on. So we think that all the stars probably have planetary systems, right? But think about that. We have to see the thing pass in front of the star to even pick it up with our current instruments, right? And this object passes in front of a pulsar. So suddenly we discover that there's something there. But how many things are there that don't go right in front of the star?
That's so true.
I mean, how many systems and devices and planetary objects may be set up that they're not using radio waves, so they're not beaconing us back a bunch of radio signals saying, hey, we heard your songs from the 50s that you sent out in your Voyager craft, because they're not even using that mechanism to communicate anymore. So they're not trying to beacon us. And maybe every once in a while, I think a star family does set up a laser device or something to just kind of give us a little tickle to be like, hey guys, yeah, we're here. But they're still basically but if you actually want to become part of this culture, you guys have to figure out this telepathy thing. You got to get the consciousness piece because this is critical for you to become part of the civilization.
Yeah. Well, ask Maury's question, and then there's the question by B. Vinicus, but Go
Okay,
ahead.
Maurice is asking, I was wondering how electrons, the God particle consciousness, fits into this science.
Thank you. Thank you so much for resurfacing that question, because I saw it as I was scanning through and I was like, I never mentioned electrons. I should probably do that. So essentially, check it out. If space-time is the whole thing, like it's all just a lattice of light, right? Then you have a portion of space-time that's curved into a bundle that we call a proton. And that bundle sphere of a proton is spinning, but because it's going at the speed of light around the equator, it's shearing. And so it's acting like a little spaceship. So it's able to float around and only has a little bit of mass instead of a ton of mass, right? But where the sphere is spinning slower than the speed of light is on the sides of that sphere going up to the top and the bottom, right? So like you've got the equator of the sphere where it's acting as if it has zero mass and it's timeless. It's going the speed of light, no time's passing. It's in a state of sort of perpetual spin, right? Like they say there's no such thing as perpetual motion devices. Bullshit, protons. And so when you go up from the equator, it's going slower and slower and slower towards the pole. And in those areas, it's creating tension and torsion. So it's pulling on space-time. So in those zones, essentially space-time is getting pulled around the proton, and you've got a vortex of space-time. And that vortex of co-moving space-time, as that charge moves around, as that field of light moves around, we call that electrons. Electrons aren't really point particles. No study of electrons has ever suggested there's any such thing as a point particle called an electron. We have theorized that the position of the charge is stronger maybe in a certain location, and the theorization of the center of charge has given us particle positioning. But as soon as you try to measure the angular momentum of that charge, it's a wave. And this is the particle wave duality, right? Where we're like, right, how is it a particle and a wave? Well, check it out. It's actually just a field. And the field is a vibratory wave field. And that vibratory wave field has packages, essentially areas where the wave overlaps are stronger and weaker. And where the wave overlaps are stronger, those are the things that we call electrons. And because these electrons are actually just co-moving space-time, and the object of electron itself is actually just light, then now this is how we get Wheeler's God particle vision, where he's like, maybe there's just one electron. Maybe because it's light and it's moving it, and it can move at the speed of light and be light. Maybe there's just one because there's no time for the electron. So maybe the electron can be everywhere at the same time in our perception. It's all just one, but it's always perceived in all these places. I'm like, well, that's a pretty cool, trippy vision, bro. And we can still understand that that's true of everything. Like the entire structure of space-time is holographic. Like, how do you know what's this and what's that? Well, it is all the same in a way, but it's all operating within space-time in different ways, meaning that different atoms and the combinations of protons co-spinning together create different densities and patterns of the fields that spin around them. So we get all of these different kinds of electron fields that we describe for different kinds of atoms and different patterns and geometries of those. And essentially, they're just all different complexities of co-moving fields. And those co-moving fields tell that proton set or that atomic set or molecular set how to bond or interact with other sets of fields around it. So when you take your hand and you put it down on the desk, it's not because the protons hit each other. That stops because the electrons in the bonded field of the molecular vibrational field here, those fields are in repulsion to merging with the fields that are on the surface of your hand. And so what you're actually experiencing is an electromagnetic field repulsion, just like magnets pushing each other apart. But we have all these cool sensory devices to pick up those electromagnetic responses that we translate then to our nervous system and, biological senses.
But you just restructured all of chemistry with that idea, because they have the bonds, right? And the periodical table, and the carbon has 6, and so it fits with 6. So yeah, go into that a little bit more, because
Sure.
if we structure chemistry,
Yeah.
then we can do much more, because we're working energetically, not
Yeah.
matter-wise. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the principles of moles and essentially like how a specific electron set in one atom can bond to another, all
Mhm.
of those basic principles remain true with our massive simplification that we've done. And the simplification is just like, okay, if there's this many protons, we know that in general there's this many electrons, and that we know if it has a positive charge, then it's got less electrons. If it has a negative charge, it has more electrons. So we know the basics, like ion or not ion, bondable or not bondable. You mix these things and they do this effect. And you can do experimental theory that play off of all of those concepts, and they absolutely work. But none of those things negate that the electron field is still a field, and that field is somehow actually developed, and the torsion is created by the actual nucleus itself, by the proton itself, where, and that co-created field can also be driven out of atoms and through pipelines of other forms of matter. So we know that co-moving field, if we do something just right with an atom, we can shake some of that field off, and that field that leaves, the co-moving PSU that leave, they can go travel and chain around, through other molecular structures, adding to the molecule, and then it releases, adding to a molecule and it releases.
Is that electricity?
This is how it travels.
Are you describing
I'm
electricity?
describing electricity. That's how electricity moves through wires.
Wow. Well, B. Vinicus has in Orlando has a question. Is
Okay,
the pulsar just a large spinning proton, or maybe more elaborate? And what is the structure of the pulsar, basically?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not a full expert on pulsars, and I'll just say that off the bat. And as you said, Alan, like that's probably an area that I need to dive into, and maybe I'll get more codes once I really get into them. But essentially, proton pulsars and other classes of what we call neutron stars are generally understood to be massive star areas where the nucleus of all the atomic structures within those stars are closer together, more tightly packed than the tightest crystals that we are aware of. In other words, like we think of diamonds as very hard structures. Well, now imagine an object where the atomic structure is more compressed than that, and more highly coherent than that, and geometric than that. And the diamond is at, crazy amounts of heat and crazy amounts of light energy, right, in it, right? So you can think of it as like zones where the molecular structures and the atoms within that structure are pushed really close together and in high coherent geometric, geodesic likely structures. So it is, in a very real sense, almost like a macrocosmic echo of what a proton is doing. But it's not quite as perfect, right? It's never going to be as perfect as a proton, but it will approach that perfection. And because it's approaching that perfection of level of connected coherence, very special properties. And those properties like the twin X-ray beams coming off of it, and it's like the way that a pulsar spins, its stability, its this longevity of a proton, or a pulsar is very different than other stars. And then there's one step further than that, which is when you have an actual black hole. And when you have an actual black hole, it's that the aggregate matter and mass is now actually operating as one single unit. And so essentially the idea of a singularity is where all the mass and all the atoms and all the structures actually get into complete geodesic coherence so that they act as a single object. And that is actually the larger scale of a proton. And so because protons are the core of that, protons are a black hole. And
Mm.
so when you have a bunch of protons all acting in perfect coherence, exactly geometrically and geodesically in the model of each individual one, we now have the next fractal layer up.
Wow. So Andrea says, could it be so close together like it might share the same space, like being in the same space at the same time, like multiversing?
Yeah, I would say probably in the proton case, like no, because these objects, while they have a specific charge radius, the likelihood of them crossing into fully intersecting structure, gosh, I don't know. The classical mechanics of that kind of make my brain go, I don't know if that would work, because each of them is co-spinning and co-moving. Could they be sharing, positions in their equator and crossing over each other and nested together, just like the PSU are inside of the proton? I mean, it's maybe, but I can't say no to that, because I mean, maybe there's a theoretical model that would explain that. But in general, I think of protons as the, kind of the hard balls of the universe, because their structure is so solid, coherent, and dialed into that, speed of light boundary condition, that at least in atoms, the way we see them is they cluster, but exactly at the horizon. They do not cross penetrate. They meet each other in one Planck length of space, and they're like locked in, and they are bonded hardcore. And they're bonded so hardcore that if we break them apart, we get a nuclear bomb.
Right. A couple of more questions I have, because you're here and you might know the answer.
Sure.
Is that because there's different mass, and these are intense masses, and pushing in on time space, we get a different time lag around different stars.
Sure.
And so the time lagging as we travel from star system to star system would affect consciousness, or the perceptions of consciousness. So how do we get around that as we travel around the universe?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually, there's absolutely going to be a self-coherent state of time around any gravitational field, right?
Right.
So,
and it's different from gravitational field to gravitational.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Our experience of time would be slightly different if we lived on Jupiter, if Jupiter had a surface, because it's a much bigger gravity ball, right? So it's actually going to influence our experience of time, as well as, obviously our bodies. And this is also why when we accelerate in a spaceship, time is dilated slightly. Clocks change on airplanes. Many people don't realize that, but when you travel on a plane, you actually are dilating space-time a little bit, right? So because you're in a different level of space-time flow, you're traveling through space-time at a different speed. Now, where that gets really interesting is when you start looking at what are the gravitational field states like for stars around the core of the galaxy. Like, because when you look at those star systems, they're like super high torsion gravitational fields where stars are very close. Imagine if you looked into the night sky and it was never dark, because the stars are so bright and brilliant that it's like the entire sky is lit up with these huge bright points of light just all over the place, like just crazy. Not as big as our sun, but like, maybe like several times bigger and brighter than Sirius is from Earth, for example, which is 4 light years away, essentially, right? And so basically you're just like surrounded by gravitational fields, and would, because of the density and the intensity of the gravitational flow within those spaces, could you still be in a sweet spot on a planet that still allows biological life like this? Yeah, probably. Or in a ship that protects the gravity field or diminishes it subtly? Yes. And could you go into that zone and essentially time travel to the future, because you are experiencing time much slower than everybody else is? And that's the interesting thing about time dilation, is you experience time going slower than everybody else, because you're going closer to the speed of light, which is like the relative time differentiation point, right? And so if you went and hung out there,
there's no time at the speed of light, right?
Yeah. So if you went and hung out there you could go hang out there for 5 minutes and maybe on another planet 5 years have passed, way further out in the galactic rim. And so this is really, it's really a fascinating concept. And Jenna Layden actually, I think, is on this conference. You know, she and I were going deep on this, and she was saying she thinks that she actually has a body that's stored on a ship that's close to the center of the galaxy. And she has it there so that that body's experience of time is way, way slower than her experience of time in this life in her lives on Earth, which she and I share. And we have a lot of, you know, experiences in the past with each other. And so once she's done with all of these incarnation missions, she's got a physical body she can go back and incarnate back into, you know, 10,000 years later or 20,000 years later, that will still be young because it's been in these massive time dilated gravity spaces. And I just thought, wow, that is a fascinating concept, and could explain why some people feel unconditionally like they're sure they've got a body out there somewhere. Even though they're incarnated in this one, they've like kept, you know, they kept their other flesh meat suit because they want to go back to it, which I'm like, well, okay, cool. Yeah, like that's one way to do it, I guess. You know, if you can, maybe you could, maybe you should. I don't know.
Well, I have one more question. How about you, Neil? Do you have another question?
Yeah, I'll do a question right at the end.
Okay, the question I have, and then there's maybe two more. I know you've given us a lot of time. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, sure,
the
man.
question I've never heard anyone answer, because maybe they don't, they're too slow in time, is that the formation of planets. Are they coagulations of stardust? Are they birthed from the mother star? I mean, no one has come up with a really logical, coherent theory about planet formations.
Well, I mean, I think that the general consensus is a pretty good one. So you've got essentially, you know, nebulas, which are gaseous fields, you know, and nebulas, and all of that gas in a nebula field essentially aggregates into around an existing black hole. Now, this piece is not in modern science, but an existing black hole is already spinning there because space-time's full of them. And so matter and mass aggregates around one of these existing miniature black holes. A proton starts it all off or whatever. And eventually you grow and birth a star out of that. A star evolves until it's a, you know, red giant. Eventually it goes supernova because it burns up all of its hydrogen. And as soon as it goes supernova, it fuses a bunch of that hydrogen and that helium into much more advanced molecular structures and atom structures. So we get all these cool elements like carbon and iron and all these cool things. But all of that's like splattered about, right? And that's its own nebula. And then you have another star in that nebula that's now aggregating around it, you know, all of this gas as well as iron, as well as, you know, higher and denser molecules. And the really dense ones attract to it themselves and build upon themselves. And eventually you grow a planet. And that planet is, you know, what does it grow around? Well, it grows around a tiny vortex in space-time, which we call a black hole. And all of space-time is full of these little vortices awaiting the births of planets and stars and et cetera. And eventually you get a bunch of these little vortices and they form an entire planetary system.
So is the toroidal field event horizon then?
Is the toroidal field an event horizon? In the case of like a proton, yes, it's charge radius, the edge of the toroidal field, essentially, that it is, although it's very much more spherical with, you know, small vortices in the tip at the bottom. That, yes, is like an event horizon. And the event horizon of a black hole is just whatever that charge boundary condition distance is of the amount of mass that's come into total coherence within the heart of it. So when you're growing a planet, yes, you're going from one proton forming the center of that singularity at the center of a planet to many protons doing that. So we have actually a pretty good size black hole at the core of the Earth. And that black hole is essentially it's like the idea of a black hole is just totally the wrong idea, but it's essentially highly coherent condensed space-time in total coherence and singularity that's essentially acting as like, as someone asked in the chat, you know, if space is flowing into the Earth, where does it go to? Well, it's moving down and into the coherence at the core of the planet. And essentially that information and energy is traveling back out and into the planet because the planet is living and growing and moving. Like the planet itself is absorbing space-time and becoming more of what it is. And we're also radiating information out into space-time. So there's this exchange that's going on.
But why are all planets, well, at least in this solar system, sort of different, or are they all in different stages of evolution? So we may become like Mars. Mars may then expand into Jupiter. Is it something like that, or are there different cofactors?
Depending on where the gases and the heavier molecules and metals and stuff are positioned, those regions around a star may lead to the development of a gas giant versus the development of a rocky planet like Earth. And so, Mars and Earth are pretty self-similar. Venus has way more sulfur. Mercury has way more of other specific elements. And so each distance zone from the star has different kind of zones where a different kind of planet is going to aggregate. So, just being in the Goldilocks zone, as we say, doesn't necessarily mean life is guaranteed, but it's still very likely because we know now that water is a heavily propagated element throughout the entire universe. And that's amazing, right? Like it's like the source, the structure of memory and life is everywhere. Guys, I'm actually late for a dinner with Robert Grant and the Egypt team. I'm actually supposed to go into town and meet up with those guys. So I'm going to have to get off the Starship soon.
Last question, Adam. Well, let's close it off like this, if you don't mind.
Bring in consciousness a little bit there, Neil.
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going. So just to preface it with this, a few years ago, there was another study that came out, and they were able to, bilocate on the subatomic particles, because two particles can exist in the same place, and now they've been able to do this with hydrogen atoms around 2,000 times the size of a regular atom existing in two places at once, which kind of is like the beginning of us being able to do that on a bigger scale, right? So my question is, we're tapping into all of this technology now, right? We're doing it, even mainstream's coming out with some of it, let alone all the stuff that we aren't even privy to. So how do you see our future in regards to this technology becoming prevalent on this planet? And how does that connect to our level of consciousness and able to be able to use this in a conscious way? Whereas if our technology is exponential, but our consciousness is not there, we could use it for other reasons, right? That might not be for the betterment of everyone.
Yeah. From the perspective of a lot of the galactic communities that I have spoken with out there in the universe, they share a belief that there is a natural timing pattern to the way a species becomes part of this galactic community. And that timing pattern of being able to actually release and share the technologies needed to bring a whole species to these other levels is also modulated by the level of trust that species has in itself and in each other. And so there's a really direct tie to our spiritual development and our philosophical and psychological development, our relationships with each other, that is linked to our capacity to actually have these technologies and be able to use them. Now, that's not to say that it's not possible for certain areas and parts of a species to reach that evolution, and others may not be there yet. But if those beings that are reaching that state of awareness and that growth in consciousness, people like on this Zoom webinar probably, and a lot of the people in your this whole conference, and a lot of people attending this conference, people that deeply want to see life thrive on Earth, people who deeply want to understand what it means to not be alone in the galaxy, like this state and condition and intention is going to lead you to an evolution of your own self to become a better steward for the planetary culture that is forming. And that stewardship is what's truly required, because as we move forward, it's not going to be the completely blind, not awake politicians, waving the flag, who are just front ends of military industrial complexes who are stewarding this planet. Those guys' time has come. It's over. The game is up. The lies and the trauma and the self-reinforced systems are basically, by the natural laws of existence, collapsing in upon themselves. And as that vacuum happens, and as those systems collapse, what rises is those that act out of coherence and high responsibility, integrity, relational building, truly standing for what's right and what's good, and truly standing and clearly saying, I'm not going to participate in these abusive behaviors anymore. And if you're acting in an abusive way to people and hurting people, I'm going to actually opt out from working with you or operating with you until you go through your healing process. I will work with those who have actually worked through that can own their shadow, that can actually face those things. And so we are building higher and higher planetary alliances. I mean, this is what I'm doing all day, every day, week after week, is I'm building alliances with organizations and groups focused on regenerative impact, new kinds of political structures, new kinds of societal structures, new kinds of living systems for homes and for ways that we can participate in life. And I see it as this massive swell towards a higher state of coherence at a planetary scale, in which we will have the capacity and responsibility to operate these levels of technology and use it for the good of all life, use it for the well-being of all humans and all life on this planet, and actually achieve this great leap forward in our personal evolution.
Wow.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Adam, for your work, your research, and for the future that is awakening on the consciousness and technological levels. So yeah.
Thank you.
Amazing, brother. Appreciate you so much, man.
It's my pleasure and honor, gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here with you. And please have an amazing conference. And I'll see you all again soon.
See you soon.
We'll do more. Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Aloha.
Thanks.
After 3 years of having to produce the Portal to Ascension conference online, we have been waiting for this moment. The Portal to Ascension conference is returning live and in person. Join us at the Marina Village in San Diego, California, April 21st to 23rd, 2023. As massive shifts are happening on the planet and hidden truths are being uncovered, we are piecing together the fragmented parts of our existence and timeline. At Portal to Ascension, we are dedicated to full circle awareness of the truth of who we are and remembrance of our connection to the cosmos. This is showtime. There is no holding back. Now is the time for us to harmonize the frequencies and create unity and peace on Earth. We are deprogramming from an outdated matrix system, re-educating and remembering an inherent truth that connects us all. As we come together, we activate our truest potentials, individual gifts, and collective resolve. We are ushering a whole new reality that we know is possible and is waiting for us to embrace it. Join founder Neil Gore and the entire Portal to Ascension team with hosts Alan Steinfeld, Michelle Anderson, and Joan of Angels over these 3 days, April 21st to 23rd, 2023. We will experience musical performances by Larissa Stowe and the Shakti Tribe, Vox Angeles, Share the Light, Admiral Apollo, and Torquemji. This conference features incredible luminaries such as JJ and Desiree Hurtak, Adam Apollo, Carolyn Corey, Robert Schock, Linda Moulton Howe, Robert Edward Grant, Barbara Lamb, and many more. Register now at ascensionconference.com. It is time for humanity to awaken.